Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to get us started today as I can see folks are starting to sign on. My name is Haley. I work for the Columbia Mountains Institute, or CMI, and I'm joined here today by Kendall Benesch with the Kootenay Conservation Program. And we are here to welcome you to CMI's 9th season of the CMI Cred Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 11th season of the Winter Webinar Series. Before we really get going, we'd like to just pause and acknowledge that the region in which both of our organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Shuswap, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. And I'd also like to give you an opportunity to provide your own acknowledgement. So in the chat, which should be located in the control ribbon at the bottom of your screen, please feel free to let us know where you're zooming in from today. All right. So to introduce this season, we'll be exploring the theme of stewarding for biodiversity. We're welcoming 4 speakers who will discuss this theme from different perspectives, emphasizing that conserving biological diversity and caring for all living things requires a variety of people, viewpoints, and practices. This series this year is financially supported by Ecoscape Environmental Consultants, LGL Limited, and KCP's program funders. And for our second webinar today, we'll be welcoming Ian Adams with the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada as the BC coordinator for the Key Biodiversity Areas, or KBAs. And we'll be learning about what KBAs are, what they are not, opportunities for on-the-ground stewardship actions for KBAs, and other applications to conservation stewardship throughout the Kootenay and Columbia region. And we'll introduce Ian in more detail in just a moment. I just realized I wanted to put that slide up for you so that you could see which other webinars are taking place in the series. All right. So while folks are still, I can see there's a few people still signing in and providing your land acknowledgements, where you're zooming in from today. I'm going to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about CMI and what it is that we do. So the Columbia Mountains Institute is a nonprofit society and an association working for people working in the various fields of ecology. And what we do primarily is we put on professional development opportunities that come in the form of courses, conferences, and webinars like this. And they tackle everything from more complex land management conundrums to really skill-based courses that take place either in the field or oftentimes in a computer lab. Our website is a great place to learn more about what we do, and it contains a lot of resources, including preceding documents from all of our major events and recordings from talks like this. And what I want to do now is hand it over to Kendall, who's going to introduce KCP.
Thank you, Haley. My name's Kendall Benesch, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenay Conservation Program, or KCP. And we're a broad partnership of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, First Nations, other government agencies, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays. And the purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve the biological diversity and naturally functioning ecosystems of the region through land conservation and stewardship, and to generate the support and resources required to advance this effort, which includes sharing technical knowledge and expertise through webinars like this. We are excited to be co-hosting this webinar series again with Haley and CMI, and we'd like to give an additional thanks to all of our program sponsors, without whom we'd not be able to support this type of work. And just a couple of housekeeping details from me, and we'll get started. This webinar is being recorded, and it'll be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of Ian's presentation, so please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar, not the chat box, to add a question to the queue, and we'll do our best to make our way through them at the end. And that's it from me, so back to you, Haley.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so now I have the pleasure of introducing Ian. Ian Adams has been the BC coordinator for the Key Biodiversity Areas with the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, as I mentioned. He's based in Cranbrook in the beautiful East Kootenays, where he's worked as a professional biologist in many capacities for over 25 years. Much of his work has focused on species at risk, from badgers to tailed frogs. And previous positions of his include working on behalf of the Ktunaxa Nation Council for wildlife conservation throughout ʔamakʔis, Ktunaxa. And he has also worked for the Rocky Mountain Trench Ecosystem Restoration Program, as he has also been a consultant. Sorry, I'm really stumbling over my words. He's also worked as a consulting ecologist in various capacities and taught undergraduate biology courses at the College of the Rockies. Ian's a director of the Kootenay Conservation Program, and he chairs the board of directors with the Columbia Outdoor School, or the Blue Lake Camp. Additionally, he's the long-term president of the Symphony of the Kootenays. Ian has been an RPBio since 1997, and he holds a BSc and an MSc in wildlife ecology from the University of Guelph. Ian, we'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Haley. Thank you, Kendall. Kisikikit, Kapaniskus. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking time this afternoon to talk about KBAs. Share my screen here, hopefully. Everything's showing up well there, Haley?
Not yet.
One more button to push.
There we go.
Here we go. Awesome. Great. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. And again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to talk about key biodiversity areas, especially here in the Kootenay Columbia. What we'd like to do first is a bit of audience participation. First, we're going to take a quick poll on your knowledge of species at risk in the Kootenay Columbia region. Kendall has put a link in the chat that you can use to access a Menti website and enter up to 3 species, and we're going to generate a species at risk word cloud. She'll share a screen in a moment, and we'll ask you to type in up to 3 species at risk that come to mind from the Kootenay Columbia. Please use your common names, be a bit careful with spelling so we don't get too many different variations of various species. No worries if your species already shows up. That's the idea. The more times it's added, the bigger the word. A reminder that we're looking at the full Kootenay Boundary Natural Resource Region, shown here with the black line. It extends from the Alberta US borders up to the Big Bend, north of Revelstoke at the Mica Dam, and west to Rock Creek and the Kettle Granby areas, and west of the Arrow Lakes. So with that, please take it away, Kendall. The link will be either at the top or Kendall, if you can pop it in again at the bottom there. It should be there at the bottom of the chat. It's looking great. So we'll leave this up, and certainly through the talk, you can continue to put things in here as you wish a little bit, but as things continue, and we could certainly see the idea, which is working great here, is that we get an idea of the most well-known species at risk that are in the area. So In the interest of keeping things moving along, I am going to jump back into the screen share and we'll return to our map. Thanks for your input. Again, you can continue to do that and we'll tally up those results and make those available at the end. But appreciate that participation opportunity to take part. I'd like to start off today in the Castlegar area. An interesting component of the interior cedar hemlock forest is the presence of bedrock meadows. If you're not familiar with these sites, I recommend the recent paper by Ricarda Petch and others out of the University of Alberta on these unique features. Throughout the presentation, I've included a few QR codes for these links if you want to access them during the talk. You can hopefully take a picture with your phone and scan them. Bedrock meadows are open areas in an otherwise forested landscape created by thin soils over near surface bedrock. They tend to be quite wet, especially in the spring. They're highly sensitive to disturbance, and they can support plants that grow nowhere else because of these unique conditions. 4 of these meadows are in the Castlegar area, and they support plants that are found nowhere else in Canada. Columbia quillwort is regional endemic, known only from the US Pacific Northwest and here in BC. It's the only plant found in all 4 of these areas. Dwarf Hesperochiron and hairy paintbrush are more widespread through the western US into California, but have equally restricted occurrences here in Canada. Beavervale Meadow is the only place in Canada where hairy paintbrush is found. These aspects and other details that we'll talk about make these sites eligible as key biodiversity areas, shown here represented by centroid orange dots. Today, I'll be talking about what KBAs are, what they're not, where we're at with KBAs in the Kootenay boundary. Yes, they deal with species at risk, but they also consider all species in ecosystems too, regardless of listings. Before we leave the bedrock meadows, I'd like to give a shout out to Ryan Durand, Tyson Ehlers, and Ira Lee Anderson for bringing these sites to our attention, as well as Karina Maslavat for her work at these sites. I'm greatly appreciative of their reviews, recommendations, improvements to the KBAs. It's been a great example of how the ground-up approach works with KBAs. So what exactly is a KBA? Found across land, freshwater, marine environments, KBAs are sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity by supporting geographically restricted and threatened species and ecosystems, as well as key natural processes. They range in size from small patches of habitat to large tracts of land or water, are designated based on specific measurable criteria, and undergo extensive review. A note here that we use the term biodiversity to reflect that KBAs address far more than just species at risk, though as we see, that's a focus for KBAs here in the Kootenays. We're not calculating Shannon-Weiner biodiversity indices all around the country. They feature species, ecosystems, landscapes, biological processes, essentially the full gamut of what constitutes biodiversity. They were launched in 2016. There we go. Launched by 2016 by the IUCN and partners. The global KBA standard is a result of extensive consultations with experts to consolidate criteria and methodology for identifying what constitutes a KBA. Canada is the first country with our own national standard and is strongly based on the global one. Main difference is that our national standard accepts elements to the infraspecies levels, subspecies, varieties, populations, etc., that are deemed to be of national importance. Usually, these are populations, infraspecies elements that have been accepted by Syilx. This includes elements like southern mountain caribou or the Rocky Mountain population of northern leopard frog. As we'll see, KBAs operate largely on percentages of populations at the site level versus its overall population. For a global KBA, that overall population is across the entire species range. For a national KBA, it's just the element occurrences in Canada. So KBAs are a non-governmental process in Canada led by the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada, the latter who maintains an extensive database. The steering committee consists of these three partners, plus several environmental non-governmental organizations. ECCC has observer status on the committee and various Indigenous, provincial, and territorial partners are also involved. The Secretariat involves people actively involved in identifying KBAs around Canada and working to implement them. My role as BC coordinator has been part of this process. Several others identifying KBAs across Canada, as well as leading, coordinating the process. There's communications and outreach, as well as technical aspects of data management. It's been wonderful to work with this committed, talented team of ecologists across Canada. So how does it work? There are 5 criteria for meeting KBA designation. All of these have detailed subcategories. I'll touch here on A, B, and D as the ones that we work with most often, especially with the species-related aspects, which is how I have been involved. All species and ecosystems are potentially eligible for a key biodiversity area. Any site that supports 10% of the species' global or national population potentially meets criterion B. Note that we can measure population in a variety of ways. Number of mature individuals, the species range, or number of localities, which is usually synonymous with BC Conservation Data Center's element occurrences, among others. The large flowered ragwort, pictured here in the lower left, is an example of a species that is not considered at risk, but still meets KBA criteria. It's nationally ranked N3 by NatureServe, and almost its entire known Canadian distribution lies within the Castle, Waterton, and Akamina Key Biodiversity Area that includes Akamina-Kishnena Park in the southeast corner of BC. It's a species with restricted distribution in Canada, and it meets national B1 criteria. As species become more endangered, such as southern mountain caribou shown here under criterion A, that threshold drops. The more threatened the species, the lower the threshold. For an element ranked as endangered or critically endangered by IUCN, endangered by Syilx, or ranked G1 or N1 by NatureServe, we need just 0.5% of the global or national population to meet criteria thresholds. For IUCN vulnerable, Syilx threatened, or NatureServe G2 or N2, the threshold is 1%. Note here that we use Syilx assessments, not the Species at Risk Act. Our preference is to follow the science of Syilx versus the federal cabinet decisions of SARA. Also, provincial rankings, such as red and blue lists by the Conservation Data Center, are not applicable for KBAs because the program is national and international in scale. Ecosystems are also eligible for KBA status. They have slightly higher thresholds to qualify. Our National Ecosystem Coordinator, Lucy Poley, is leading that process. Work on BC ecosystems is slated to begin in earnest later this year. Let's look at criterion D. It identifies sites that support important biological processes, such as demographic aggregations, ecological refugia, recruitment sources. Examples include seabird aggregations, migratory staging grounds, fish spawning sites. Creston area meets national criterion D for Kootenay white sturgeon because they are known to aggregate at the south end of Kootenay Lake before moving upstream into Idaho to spawn. Criteria also have population thresholds that must be met. If a Lewis woodpecker lands in my backyard, I don't suddenly live in a KBA. We need a certain amount to get there. In all, there are several ways to get KBA status, and a site can have more than one criterion. So let's go back to one of our bedrock meadows that I mentioned. Beavervale Meadow has all 3 of the listed species that I touched on earlier: Columbia quillwort, dwarf hesperochyron, and hairy paintbrush. Because the KBA extends beyond the meadow to include slopes above it that provide runoff to keep the meadow wet, another species turns up, diamond clarkia. There's another regional endemic known only from a few Canadian locations in the Pend d'Oreille as well as here at Beavervale. As you can see, the rankings of the species, and we only need one, as well as the KBA criteria that each meet. Species can meet multiple criteria. For the quillwort, for example, meets global criteria for having the site hold over 0.5% of its global population as a G1 species. The site does not hold over 10% of its global population, however, though it does hold over 10% of its Canadian population, so it meets national criterion for B1. In short, in this one small area, we have multiple species meeting multiple criteria and thresholds in an important key biodiversity area. Okay, so we have a key biodiversity area. What now? The result is a scientifically robust, credible tool that captures a wide range of biodiversity values. They are widely accepted as an important tool for informing a range of conservation actions, from identifying possible protected areas to highlighting sites that support species in need of mindful stewardship. The KBA designation does not invoke management prescriptions. It does not provide any protected status, nor does it impact access to land or water. It's strictly an information layer. They're not negotiated. Either it meets the criteria or it does not. They're guided by the species and ecosystems ecology, so there's no limit to size, either big or small. It's the scale of the species that inform the KBA that is important in determining its size. KBAs are blind to land status and may encompass private or public lands and waters. They sometimes overlap, either partially or entirely, already legally protected areas. In all, it's a very grassroots process. They're identified, developed locally, but ultimately approved by a national or global secretariat to ensure that consistent criteria are met. Once completed, spatial area layers and supporting information are publicly available so that the KBA can be effectively used in land and water stewardship actions. The key point here is that KBAs should be viewed as a complementary to other conservation measures. They're only one tool in a box that includes things locally, like wildlife habitat areas, wildlife habitat features, federal critical habitat, riparian area regulations, formal protected areas, and others. So why do this? Quick answer, because I think they're needed. Questions inevitably get raised as, what's the point if the sites and their values are not protected? And if it's already protected in a park or other conservation vehicle, why bother? The main value is as a globally recognized, scientifically robust recognition that the site meets a standardized criteria and thresholds for conservation importance. They're inclusive of all government types. They're available to everyone. They go beyond species or ecosystems at risk. They go beyond the charismatic megaflora and megafauna that capture so much of our focus and dollars and efforts. From quillworts to caribou, KBAs are sites of disproportionate importance to the persistence of all national and global biodiversity. Although Leopold famously said that the first part of intelligent tinkering is saving all the parts, KBAs help us recognize where those parts are. Their objective, apolitical foundation on robust science or other knowledge forms makes them reliable to all sources, from government to industry to NGOs. So where are we? Let's look at the KBAs within the Kootenay boundary region. With the help of many people across the province and beyond, we've made substantial progress in BC, in the Kootenay Columbia, and across Canada. Locally, we have 19 KBAs either approved or somewhere along the pipeline towards completion. Provincially, we're at about 170 sites, exclusive of Haida Gwaii, which is not surprisingly a rather unique situation and under its own separate process of identification. The pink KBAs here are in draft. Line work may change, so don't look at them too closely yet. There are 7 published sites shown here in green. That line work is complete. They range in size from Mount Baldy that straddles the Thompson-Okanagan boundary down here in the lower left to our Beavervale Meadow. Those sites are 22, 37 hectares respectively. The largest site in the region is Columbia North Groundhog, up here at the north end, coming in at over 6,500 square kilometers. They cover the gamut of habitat types, from grasslands at ʔamakʔis in the Kettle Valley to interior rainforests. There's creston wetlands, mid-elevation montane forests. Lakes, streams, and rivers are all represented. Equally, all beck zones that occur in the region are also represented here. I'll note that I didn't go out looking to try to make sure that everything was represented. We had a focus on what species and where those occur. The fact that it came out as being so nicely balanced across ecosystems type is I think, indicative of the value of the species and where those are locally. Information on the KBAs here and across the country is available on our website, map viewer at kbacanada.org, the link here at the bottom. A note here that the default view on the online map is just the approved KBAs, the ones in green here. If you click on, and this little box shows up in the lower right corner, and you turn on the candidate key biodiversity areas, you'll spray paint the map with orange dots that show the sites in progress. Click on any individual dot and you'll see what species or ecosystems are being considered at that location. Let's look at the breakdown of the species that are contributing to KBAs. There's 36 different elements or species, a strong bias to vascular plants, which is not too surprising, but otherwise a fairly good distribution across most major taxonomic units. Perhaps most conspicuously absent from this region are insects. There's very likely a bee or two that meet criteria within the region, but data for these are scarce and hard to get. If we look at federally listed species at risk, these are the ones that are contributing to KBAs. Here we have this breakdown of those that are currently contributing to KBAs in the region. There's only 2 species that are listed by IUCN as endangered. The short-faced lynx, which is a small snail endemic to the Columbia River system, found in Canada only below the Keenly Side Dam at Castlegar, and whitebark pine. Both the tiger salamander and Spalding's campion, pictured here on the left, are CIWC endangered. The campion, or catchfly, is also a G2 species, and the KBA at ʔamakʔis, Tobacco Plains, meets thresholds as being globally significant. Other lesser known species that may or may not show up in our word cloud are things like Haller's apple moss, smoker's lung lichen, ashy pebble snail, the diamond clarkia that we saw earlier. A number of species in the Crown of the Continent area, back in ʔamakʔis kishnena, show up here as their only occurrence within Canada. Of course, there are provincially listed elements on the red and blue lists, as well as CIWC special concern species. Those aren't represented here because they don't factor into key biodiversity areas. It's a reminder that KBAs are just one vehicle in the conservation garage. A range of tools are needed to maintain all biodiversity. So how about protected areas? If we think about parks and ecological reserves as places to protect our species at risk, the data here aren't all that supportive of that. Under half of the KBAs that we've identified to date have some amount of protected area within it, be it provincial, federal, or private land conservancy. And if we look at the area involved, just 7.6% of the KBA area identified to date is within a protected area. You go back to our bedrock meadow KBAs, none of those have protection. Note that some of the fee simple lands here are very small overlaps. The Fort Shepherd property near Trail slightly overlaps the Columbia River Keenly Side KBA along its shoreline in a few places. Picture here, by the way, features BC Parks, Amanda Weber-Roy and Craig Brown in Gilnockie Provincial Park, helping to collect eDNA water samples for Rocky Mountain-tailed frog. How about stewardship opportunities? The theme of the webinar series is stewarding for biodiversity. KBAs help to identify sites of important biodiversity. Not all sites for sure, but many of the important ones. KBAs are ideal building blocks for biodiversity stewardship and conservation in Canada. From identifying where new protected areas, or OECMs, other ecologically conserved measures, other ecological areas that are needed most, to basic land use planning at all levels of government. Many Indigenous nations are using KBAs as part of justification for Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Side note here that almost every First Nation that we've met with, and there's been over 200 communities across BC alone, have been very supportive of KBAs, and many have inquired if there are opportunities for KBAs within their territory. That KBAs are not prescriptive and not telling nations what they can or cannot do with their lands and waters makes them a very compelling conservation vehicle. Liam Reagan with BC Nature, WCS's Peter Chaurier are leading this important Indigenous outreach process across Canada. There are a number of other positive outcomes from KBA designations as well. Supporting funding applications, biodiversity monitoring, such as the BCI Naturalist Project, to opportunities for both federal and provincial governments to meet their respective 30 by 30 commitments. Publicly, they offer a great way to inspire public about biodiversity values that surround us, and especially a way to introduce perhaps lesser known species that need mindful stewardship. One of the best ways to contribute to ground stewardship is to make information freely available. Line work for KBAs is open access, freely available off our website. Sometimes it can be a little finicky to use, but it's there, and the link here provides instructions. So this is a website specifically on how to access and download data. If you go to our map viewer, you can either zoom in to the site that you're interested in, or up here in the upper left, you can start typing in the name of the KBA that you're interested in. And this will pull up a screen that looks like this. Once you have the site highlighted, click on download down here under the green boxes, and you'll be taken to a quick form to fill out to access shape files if you're interested in spatial data, or a CSV spreadsheet file that provides all of the information that supports the KBA. You're welcome to reach out to me or others if you have any questions about asking KBA, accessing KBA information or the spatial data. Each site also collects observations using both iNaturalist and eBird. On each KBA webpage, there are links to access lists of species that are identified on iNaturalist. For example, it pulls up the page here from the Yakutak Nucleate Tobacco Plains KBA, or you can submit a eBird checklist if you're birding in the area. Citizen science applications provide a wealth of data information that we previously didn't have. In particular, I've used research-grade iNaturalist data on almost a daily basis with the KBA work. Finally, the Secretariat is working on developing a caretaker network, strongly based on caretakers from the legacy important bird areas. The similar role to ecological reserve wardens as well. Local individuals interested in the conservation of these sites can be champions of the area and help steward the natural values of the site. If you're interested in a KBA near you, there's a webinar next Tuesday on the transition from IBAs to KBAs and the role caretakers can continue to take in these sites. You're welcome to register here if you're interested. That's pretty much it. I'll conclude with some acknowledgements because the work has involved so many people. Fundings come from Sitka Foundation, Government BC, and ECCC. The partnership with Birds Canada, NatureServe, along with BC Nature and the Conservation Data Center has been invaluable, particularly working with Molly Bradford and Amanda Beekle at Birds Canada. Liam Reagan with BC Nature has been wonderfully productive. Support and interest from the Indigenous community is gratifying and appreciated. I've connected with over 300 fellow biologists, naturalists, and conservations around the province, including many of you on the call here today. Thank you for your work, your passion, and your commitment to our biodiversity. To the dozens of reviewers who have helped us improve the sites, ensure that they're scientifically sound based on the best information available, thank you. So that's about it. I'm happy to turn over to if you have questions, comments, or discussion on anything that you've heard.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, you covered a lot, and we've got lots of time left for questions, which is fantastic. So everyone, this is what we're going to do. We're going to be using the Q&A function to pose our questions. I see that there's at least one question that's gone into the chat. If we could take anything from the chat and move it over to the Q&A, that'd be great. If you look at that little control panel at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon. It says Q&A. There's a little question mark and a little sort of like quote box. Click that open and you can type your questions right in there. And if you see a question in there that you'd like to hear the answer to, give it a thumbs up. That'll, it's called upvoting, and I'll be able to order the questions in order of most upvotes, and I'll ask the most popular questions first, more or less anyways, is how that's going to go. So I'll relay the questions to you, Ian, and we'll go from there. So I just want to address the first question that came up from Jessica, and she's asking if this talk will be recorded and provided to the participants who are here today and everybody who's registered. And the answer is yes, you're being recorded right now. And the recording will go up on both the KCP and the CMI web pages. And you'll get a prompt, like you'll get an email from Zoom, I think, automatically, and it'll help direct you to those web pages. So those will be up within a couple of days. So let's see what we've got. There's a question first from Andrea, and she says, what's the typical timeline, if there is one, from identifying a potential KBA to having it officially designated as such?
That's a great question. The answer is it's wildly variable. A lot of it depends on the amount of information that's available. So if we have everything in hand, we can develop the proposal fairly quickly. The important part of KBAs and what gives them their strength is the review process. So what I didn't touch on is I can explain a bit more how those reviews go. The first part is a technical review, and that is the person who's developed it, myself in the most case here, sends that out to people identified who are familiar with the species that are there or that are familiar with the area that are there that covers the KBA. So that's technical, and that makes sure that our line work makes sense, is justified in the right spot. It makes sure that the numbers that we're using to base the KBA on are accurate or most up to date. And so that process, and then that comes back to me. I adopt those edits and changes, and then I pass it along to our national quality control officer, Andrea Leung, who works with WCS Canada. And she has a crazy job of facilitating all of the KBAs across Canada. And that goes out to a general review process. So that will go out to stakeholders, rights holders, land managers, typically within the provincial or federal government. That is where First Nations usually see it for the most part. And that general review process, it's also available off the website. If you go onto that, say in one of those orange dot sites, if it's in general review, if there's links in there that will provide you an opportunity to review that site. So those general reviews essentially from pretty much anybody who wants to comment on it. And that process, typically we try to give people 1 to 2 weeks or so, but reviewers are busy and it often takes much longer. So we have sites that I've been working on for well over a year, some cases 2 years. Other sites chug through very quickly. So part of it is dependent on those reviewers getting back to us. Most are great. Sometimes we have to chase some down to get those back. From there, after the general review, those edits are incorporated and it goes to that steering committee. And they have a look at it. They're making sure that the things are being consistent, that the criteria are consistently applied. If they're familiar with the species of the people, they may know of, hey, did you talk to Haley Ross about this one? Because she's an expert on this species. So there's questions there that can come up. And at that point, then we can, once it's approved by the steering committee nationally, it gets approved. There's also a global steering committee and secretariat that looks at sites that meet global criteria.
Okay, thanks for that detailed answer, Ian. Okay, here's a good question from Liam, and he says, were there any KBA triggers that you learned about through this process that surprised you? Were there any species you thought would qualify that didn't?
Another good question. I would say certainly the bedrock meadows, and I give a shout out there to Ryan Duran, Tyson Ehlers, Irely Anderson folks. I had no idea those existed. So those were, or those species were there. So that was very much new one, and that's the case around the province. I do this work from my home-based office in the southeast corner of the province, and learning about things on the coast, marine species. There's been a host of things that I've learned about. It's been wildly educational and a lot of fun. Species that do meet that wouldn't. Badgers are tricky. KBAs are difficult to work with wide-ranging carnivores. So things like badger that have massive home ranges, things that are difficult to get a handle on how many individuals are out there. I've a lot of background with working with badger conservation and stewardship in the province, and kind of hopeful that we are working at it, and even still this morning working on comments and how to make badger work as a KBA trigger. So it's been a tricky one, and that type of more wide-ranging species has been more difficult to work with.
Okay, this is a good follow-up question from Kevin Bollifer. How do you formulate KBAs for species like caribou, animals that cover large ranges and elevational migrations?
Caribou have been tricky. I can outline the process that I've used for the caribou KBAs through. We have confidentiality agreements left and right with this because a lot of the data is highly sensitive, and one of those is caribou. And what I've done with caribou is taken, rather than looking at the provincial range mapping that is available off the provincial caribou website, I've managed to access and they've provided me with the actual telemetry data of the caribou, and most of these herds have a fair number, a good proportion of the adult females that have had GPS collars on them. So there's some very good caribou telemetry data out there. I took those, looked at the watersheds, the sort of localized third order watersheds that they're using, and within the last 10-15 years, KBAs are working on one of the other aspects. We need the species to be extant. We need to know it's there. We need to know that it is at least capable of reproducing, and not necessarily, it doesn't need to be a viable population, but it needs to be there and capable of naturally reproducing on its own. So we're looking at, and fairly recently, in the last, say, 10-15 years. So rather than using caribou herds that have declined substantially, we've been looking at sort of going back 10 to 15 years where those GPS collars started getting applied. So that sort of formed the basis of that. I refined that based on some Beck zones, critical habitat in some cases, ungulate winter range, some of the line work that is out there, and came up with a bit more what I think and hope is areas that caribou herds are using currently. Work that then goes to the technical review side. So the people who are actually looking at those caribou closely, whether it's Quintet herd up north or Columbia North herd here, Central Selkirk's, to make sure that those are actually accurate. Central Selkirk's KBA, which is at the steering committee level, it should be published very soon. Aaron Reed, who's the regional caribou biologist, commented on that, and we did tweak the line work based on his review of that, and noting some places where caribou are recolonizing a bit with that herd. So that has helped go through that delineation process. So hopefully I've answered that question.
I think you did. Okay, here's a great question from Don Gayton. He says, are there issues of ecological connectivity and migratory corridors that are considered in the KBA process?
Great question. First of all, hi Don, thanks for joining in. Thank you for your contributions with a couple KBAs, South Okanagan, Trout Creek Ecological Reserve. Much appreciate your experience and wisdom. Corridors and things, it's actually a great great question, because one of my post KBA things is joining in with the Kootenay Connect process that's going on. In fact, I'm missing a meeting that's currently going on in Invermere with Kootenay Connect that looks exactly at that connectivity and corridors. That's not one of the criteria that KBAs are directly looking at, so that there's no criterion that says this is a corridor, so it should be a KBA. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of common ground and overlap. If it's an area where species at risk, species that are geographically restricted in certain areas, those tend to overlap with a lot of those corridors. So there's certainly commonalities there, but there is not an actual criterion that says because this is identified as a corridor, it should be a KBA.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian. Okay, this next question has a number of sort of sub comments to it that are specific to a particular area or a particular issue, but I'm just going to ask the first overarching question and then suggest that George and Jessica potentially get in touch with you for further detail on what they're asking. So Eric starts out by saying, can you talk briefly about partnering or collaborating with groups in the United States?
Sure. It depends, if it's a global species, if it's things like Columbia quillwort, that meets global criterion. Part of the process that I have to document is to develop that to demonstrate that it meets global KBA criteria is a bit more knowledge about where that species is in the US. Columbia quillwort one, Spalding's campion was another one. Though the KBA is focused in Canada, I need to be able to demonstrate its global range, which often includes down into Washington, Oregon, and points beyond. So in many cases, I've been in touch with folks at CDC counterparts. They have different names in different places at Washington, Montana, Oregon, things like that to demonstrate that. KBAs, my understanding, and I haven't heard lately, is where KBAs are in the United States. That is certainly globally, the global initiative of moving, in particular, important bird areas under the KBA umbrella is a process that's going on globally. Folks with IUCN would be the people to talk to there. To my knowledge, there's not the national program of identifying KBAs in the United States that Canada has yet, but there may be some movement to that. I haven't heard any updates on that sort of recently, so best not to take my word on it. Probably either you can follow up with the contact KBA question here, folks on the second one here, that may be able to help you out, that provide that, or IUCN folks that may be more tied into whether KBAs in the United States is moving forward the way it has in Canada. We've been very fortunate to have that group that came together in the late 2010s to say, hey, this is a really interesting vehicle for conservation opportunities, and came together to put together a national standard that tweaked the global standard to meet national ones and move it forward within Canada.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. Okay, so there's a question from Michelle, I believe is the name. Can you elaborate on the IBA to KBA transition?
Sure. One of the reasons where KBAs first, when the concept was first generated, was people that came together and say, we've got important bird areas, we have important amphibian reptile areas, important butterfly areas, plant areas. So a lot of very, with another one, zones for zero extinction, a lot of sites, different sort of taxonomic focused conservation processes that came up. So wouldn't it be great if we had one vehicle that covered everything? We'll call it biodiversity, it covers species, it covers processes, it covers ecosystems. And that's sort of how this KBA concept came to be. BirdLife International has been a major partner with IUCN in developing the KBA process, and there's recognition, yes, we would like to move important bird areas into the KBA umbrella. not all KBA, then they developed the KBA standards and the recognition that not all important bird areas that have been recognized as such necessarily meet KBA criteria or thresholds. In some cases, a lot of IBAs, especially here in BC, a lot of IBAs have their data outdated. As I mentioned before, 10 to 15 years, we like to have it fairly recency. A lot of these IBAs, particularly more obscure or isolated places on the coast, haven't been visited or had their information updated for 25, 30 years. So those ones, BC Nature has been wonderful at getting back out to those, updating some of that information, demonstrating that we do have, they do meet KBA criteria, in some cases finding other areas of massive bird aggregations on the coast. So those areas need to update, have had that information updated. Other IBAs don't meet those KBA criteria. The process where that is headed is still being determined. We don't want to lose those IBAs by any stretch. We don't want to lose the local champions that work with those IBAs. So how the IBA program, in short, is not disappearing. It's just being those areas are now being also recognized as key biodiversity areas as well. In some areas, actually, the Skookumchuck Prairie is a good example of that. The Skookumchuck Prairie KBA was set up as for long-billed curlew. Long-billed curlew, until last fall, until November, was Syilx special concern. It's recently, just as the last Syilx meeting, unfortunately, it's now threatened. So this may change, but because it was special concern, it did not meet the threatened biodiversity criteria for KBA. And it is not 10% of the national population, which you would otherwise require. However, Diane Cooper, who's the local caretaker, and I think is on the call here today, has found very large and significant Lewis's woodpecker populations. So we've managed to keep Skookumchuck IBA as a KBA, but we're using different species. Also, there's process, a lot of them have non-avian species that meet criteria and thresholds as well. So the Creston Valley is an example of that. It was set up as an IBA for various bird species, but we also have northern leopard frog. We have white sturgeon population that are in there that contribute to those and help maintain and show the biodiversity values, not just birds.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Such detailed answers. Okay, there's an interesting question from Sally here, and she says, what quote unquote political leverage does a KBA provide? And are you able to give any examples?
Sure. Well, provincially, after last week's mandates letters, who knows, I think is sort of the flippant answer. Certainly previous mandate letters had lots of talk about biodiversity. The hope is certainly that the provincial government is still interested in it. They've said that the 30 by 30 commitments are still there. We've had great support from BC government. My understanding from talking with my KBA colleagues is BC has sort of been the poster child of supportive provincial governments. They've been highly supportive. A lot of staff, if you're on here today, have been highly supportive. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been great and hopefully continues to be so. They are working it into land use planning process. We've met with land use planning teams, presented to aquatic KBAs, to conservation science teams around the province. It's been highly supported by the BC government. ECCC is also looking at it. Pathway to Canada Nature One projects or program, 30 by 30 commitments at the federal level. Environment Climate Change Canada has been a key partner and observer in all of this and very interested in it. Same with Parks Canada is very interested in KBAs, just having a better idea of where the biodiversity values occur. What happens with that? Does that get turned into provincial parks, into national parks? Does that get used? How that gets used, of course, is up to the individual governments. But certainly to date, we've had strong support from both federal and BC governments.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So there are a lot of questions left. We're running low on time. I'm going to ask another one that's one of the next top rated. And depending on how that goes, we might have time for one. We'll see, but we're nearing the end of our time, just so you know. So this question here says, how can this be used by developers or regulators? And then some other folks have added on to that. So for example, is Big White included in a KBA? Or yes, can this designation impact resource development like timber or mining, for example?
Again, there's no protection status. There's no change to access. It's an information layer. So no, it doesn't say you can't log, you can't mine, you can mine, you can log, whatever. It's just this value is here. It's sort of often liken it to a pirate map where here be values. We know that this occurs here. How that is implemented is up to the land manager in the area, whether it's federal land, provincial land, indigenous land, whatever. That is up to that. We're just trying to point out where significant biodiversity values occur. So no, that doesn't apply to any of that. Don't believe, no, Big White, I don't believe is currently within a KBA process as currently. So there's, yeah, that's, I think, hopefully the short answer for that.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's a question here from Alexis. I think you have addressed it to some degree, as Michael suggests, but I'll ask it because there's a number of other people looking to hear the answer to this. And so Alexis, she said, thanks for the great presentation, Ian. I'm wondering if you can talk about why SARA is not utilized for a basis of KBA and the issues with that legislation. Be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Well, again, the flippant answer is we listen to the scientists, not the politicians. So that the number of species that have the Syilx Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada have identified as and assessed as being at risk, whether that's endangered or threatened, for example, for Syilx or for KBA purposes, have said that that's that. Whether it gets for that then to get added to Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act is an act of Parliament, of federal cabinet to say, yes, this is here. And sometimes it is not added because of economic concerns. A lot of I don't think any of the listed salmon populations have been added to SARA. We have KBAs for Saginaw Lake salmon, sockeye that and Cultus Lake sockeye that have been Syilx endangered for 20 years and never added to SARA. Then so there's no protections for those species, for those stocks that are assessed as being at risk. So again, because there's no protection, it's one of the advantages of not having protection, of being blind to land status, is that we can cover all those things and just look at the ecological values and the biodiversity values that are in question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian. I'm going to answer or ask this one because I think you can answer it quickly. Is KBA data in the BCGW? Is it accessible on IMAP?
I'm not sure. The BCGW is thinking that like the data catalog,
I wish I knew the acronym also. I was hoping you might. BCGW is what it says. Oh, Amber, okay. BC Geographic Warehouse. Thanks,
yes,
Amy.
that's the data catalog, geographical. Not right now, no. In part because KBAs are still new and they're coming online. We've seen here we have 7 that are proposed. There's another 3 that are at the steering committee level that should be published soon. So it would be constantly updating. So it's easiest to go to that website that I had linked before. I can find it here quickly. No, that's not it. Where I should have it in front of me. But anyways, off of the KBA, the map viewer, here we are. Access and download data. That will take you to there. If you can, there's just the province or territory here, you get all of BC, or you can do all of Canada, just instead of bird. So you can download whatever is currently finalized. So that if you revisit that, and yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a pain to come back and update it on a regular basis, but you can check out on that, and you can access those data from there. But that's mainly it, just keeping that updated as they come online certainly over the next year and probably into the future, that it's easiest for us to do here.
Okay, wonderful. Nice work, Ian. There are some kudos for you in the chat right now. We have a number of questions we didn't get to, but we will be able to share those questions with Ian so that primarily so he can see what sort of questions are coming up. And Ian will also get a chance to go through and see everything in the chat, because I know there are a number of interesting observations that were being shared there as well. We're gonna close with some concluding comments. An apology to everybody whose questions we didn't get to. I just need to share my screen here quickly. Takes a second. All right, should be up now. Yep, thumbs up. Okay, thanks. Okay, so many thanks. Of course, we couldn't do this without our sponsors. So thanks to KCP's core sponsors. Thanks also to those who came on specifically to support the CRED Talks, Ecoscape, and LGL. Thanks, Ian, for your time and sharing that encyclopedic mind that you have. So impressive. I want now to just plug the talk for next week. So next week we will be, not next week, in 2 weeks' time, we'll be welcoming Ryan Durand, and he's going to be delivering a talk on the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor, crafting a conservation roadmap. So he'll be featuring some really great tools and unique applications of those tools. Will be an interesting talk for sure. That's all for now. As I said, the recording will appear on KCP and CMI's websites shortly. And if you have any other follow-up questions that you'd like us to relay to Ian, we can do that. You can contact me. He's a busy guy, I will say. He might not be able to get back to all of you, but we'll make sure that those thoughts are shared. Anything else you wanted to say, Ian, before we go?
No, that's fine. I'm fine. I can stay on for a little bit longer if people are wanting to answer questions, that they do have questions, if that's okay. But I know people have busy days as well. So
okay, well, I have a few minutes also. So those of you who need to sneak out, why don't we let you do that? And I can go ahead and pose a few more of these questions to Ian for just another few minutes. Does that sound good?
sounds good.
Okay, all right. So that next question, like for the highly rated ones, came from Andrew. And he says, I'm wondering if KBAs would consider modeled abundance of species as opposed to actual counts from the field. So for some species, of course, it's difficult to determine their percent of global population in a given area in a given time. And so we rely instead on modeled habitat species products from, say, eBird.
When we talk about what's a population, there are, and I sort of touched on this briefly on trying the trade-offs between deep dives into the weeds of KBAs, and there are lots, there's a number of different ways we look at what is a population. Number of mature individuals is one. If we have that data, great, but sometimes it isn't appropriate. Like plants that erupt, or populations that erupt, like plants that have wonderful years, really productive years, and have blooms all over the place, and the next year there's hardly anything. Doesn't mean they've gone away, they're just not there. So counts of mature individuals isn't always necessarily even the best way to go about it. Number of, we can also use localities. So the number of element occurrences is CVC maps. At KBA parlance is localities. They're usually pretty close, not always. We need to check. So that's another way of doing it. What we tend to, certainly modeled populations, bird size, I would defer somewhat to, because I deal with everything except birds, is what mine has done. The folks, Molly Bradford, Amanda Beekle with Birds Canada are leading that process. And they sometimes have different methods of estimating those bird populations. Birds are great because there's a wealth of individual data, but incorporating that, how they get to there from eBird eBird estimates and things like that. Certainly from the bird standpoint, we need to talk to them and not me. What we do try to shy away from is habitat predictive models, saying this is good habitat. We think it's here. It could be here, but we need some empirical knowledge that the species actually is there. Critical habitat, very different critter from critical habitat and Sarah in that respects. Critical habitat is mapped as areas where the biophysical attributes of the species may occur. KBAs are intended to be, this is where we know this species occurs. So I don't even follow necessarily critical habitat mapping. Sometimes it's helpful, quite often not. So we try to avoid habitat suitability modeling type of things. Modeling for population size, maybe, because again, I'll defer to my avian colleagues on that question.
Great, thanks, Ian. Okay, next question, and I think we should cut it off here because there's not as many people left with us as there was before. And this is a question I would say that you did try to address through your presentation, but maybe you have a slightly different way of answering it. It just says, how are KBAs identified? Is there a list of areas to be looked at to then become candidates?
That's a great question. There's sort of a top-down approach, bottom-up. There's certainly different ways of going to it. One of the ways we rely on it is people from presentations and discussions like this, people finding out and saying, hey, is my area a KBA? And these we'd say, well, what species do you have? Things like that. And we can then look at that. The database that we have that NatureServe maintains for us, that brings in CDC data, brings in museum data, herbaria data, academic data, pretty much anything from anywhere that we can get our hands on, iNaturalist data, eBird data, then we can sort of put that out there. There is scoping, so we can say these are the species that at least meet those threatened biodiversity values. So are they the Syilx listings, the IUCN listings, things like that. A lot of it is individual things. To be honest, there is a bit of cherry picking going on, just because everywhere that meets KBA thresholds for a certain species, we don't necessarily pursue that. We could potentially have little KBAs all over the place. The intent is to find the best of the best. If we're looking at, say, I'm trying to think of a BC or a Kootenay boundary example, Lewis's woodpecker. You might have where are the most important sites for Lewis's woodpecker within the Kootenay boundary region. On the coast, another endemic, say McCown's metaphome is an endemic plant on southern Vancouver Island, a couple of Gulf Islands. It's known, I think, from 22 different sites. Each one of those theoretically could be a KBA, but we tended to look at what are the most important sites for that ones, not just where every plant shows up. So there is sort of that process. It is, the different ways that we can approach to initially identifying where should we be looking for KBAs.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Ian. Okay, let's call that. I'm going to turn my camera off for a moment. I'm going to give you a chance to have a look at the chat, but we'll be able to give you the transcript of the chat afterwards if you don't see it all.
Thank you. Thanks again to everybody who stuck around. Thanks for joining in the presentation and your interests in the KBAs.
Thanks, everybody.